Hello, this is a week with Will. We're looking at Will reviews. This is going to be a new category, new subcategory of series of videos, in particular looking at reviewing either sort of film scene or series. I mentioned a little while ago that I was looking into doing this over particular series. However, I was waiting for some of them to wrap up. And so we have a couple that have wrapped up. So this will be the first one. Ideally, I will get the next one out soonish once I've sort of worked out sort of which key points to go over. So the first one I'd like to go through with you today, as you can tell by a little bit by the theme, is Star Wars. So I'd like to talk about The Acolyte. So The Acolyte is a new Star Wars TV series that was based on the High Republic era. So this is sort of good sort of few hundred years before the main sort of storyline starting with the films in episode 1. This is supposed to be considered a sort of time of peace, sort of prosperity, everything sort of going very well with the Republic. There's been no major issues or concerns over the Sith or sort of anything like that. So this is very much sort of ideally kept as a separate entity from other Star Wars material which has been released, in keeping it of a very different time zone, where many of the other TV series have been sort of placed between certain films. For example, Clone Wars series sort of set between 2 and 3, Bad Batch set between 3 and 4, Mandalorian and sort of Book of Boba Fett and sort of Ahsoka sort of set between 6 and 7, sort of looking between, sort of trying to fill in the gaps, trying to make the whole timeline more complete, more solid. So this is not in that main timeline. It's way out of the way to keep it as a separate entity. This in itself, I think, is a fun and interesting move, because I would rather a storyline should be focused and fixated upon the strength of its own story, as it were. You shouldn't need to tie it up with sort of connections to any of the other forms of Star Wars. It should be able to either sink or swim down to the strength of itself. Okay, so enough about that as a brief introduction. I'm going to get into it. I'm going to go through sort of episode by episode, and then I'm going to go over some of the interesting talking points that have been mentioned by sort of other aspects of the media, and sort of where potential future lies within the series or potentially Star Wars as a whole. Cool. Thank you. So the start of the sort of the first episode looks at, you get sort of this small, well, sort of young assassin attempting to kill sort of a well-trained Jedi. I believe her name was Indara. This was played by Carrie-Anne Moss, and people would recognise from like The Matrix. And somehow sort of there sort of becomes a bit of a, Jedi appears to be sort of toiling, or sort of just toying with the sort of assassin, not bringing out the lightsaber as the indication of getting the lightsaber out is a sign that the Jedi supposedly wants to kill said person, that they're not going to attack someone unarmed. However, it gets to the stage where it begins this believe the assassin becomes a credible threat, draws the lightsaber, gets drawn into a situation where they have to then save a civilian, and the assassin leaps on this moment, or create the moment, and kills said Jedi. So this then goes into an investigation, sort of looking into the deaths of the Jedi, wanting to bring the assassin to justice. This is the main focus point for the sort of opening few episodes, where we sort of get introduced to several different Jedi at several different ranks, as it were. So we've got Sol, who's one of the main protagonists, who, I'll apologise, I'd butcher his name if I attempted to say it, who is a very recognisable face to some, having been in Squid Games. And then you've got Yord, sort of a very confident, assured Jedi, to which it looks like they've just been made up to the rank of Jedi, having been an apprentice. And you've got sort of Jeki, who's sort of a younger, sort of smaller sort of child, who's obviously currently sort of training to be a Jedi, as it were, so would be in the rank of Padawan. So we've got everything there set up. So, having mentioned that the assassin was we find out it's sort of a young woman. We cut across to identical sort of woman, who we sort of seem to believe, could this be the person that's done this? The Jedi seem to think it is because they're familiar with her, sort of get into communication, bring her in. We later on sort of realise that they're two identical sort of people, as it were, where one sort of going around sort of committing all these crimes, and the other one appears to be sort of fairly innocent throughout sort of most of it, who wants to speak to the person who appears to be a relative, a sister. And so that's sort of the basis of the opening two episodes, as the assassin attempts to go around sort of killing the other Jedi. Sort of, it appears they've sort of got a list of people to target, to kill, to get rid of. So that's the main arc of the story at the moment. The Jedi trying to stop this, failing unfortunately, but they see the pattern, they know who's being targeted, who to go after, and then so this leads to the third episode, where you get a flashback looking into these girls sort of on this faraway planet within what appears to be an almost sort of sensitive, force aware group, wanting to train the girls, to sort of initiate them into their group for the means of sort of trying to probably able to practice their acts, their abilities in peace, away from what they consider sort of a very narrow-minded view of how things should be done via the Jedi. However, the Jedi do appear. The two girls sort of become a bit different in the fact that you have Mai and you have Osha. You have Mai that very much agrees with all of her teachings and seems to be sort of very well adept with the Force, and you have Osha who does have Force abilities, seems to show a curiosity towards the Jedi, sort of thinking, well, this could be something different, I might like this, I might want this. And this sort of leads to conflict. The Jedi that are on the planet and speak to said group wish to train them. If they're Force sensitive, they believe they have right and control over these children to train them. And so they go about it, or they go about sort of testing them. Children themselves are told to fail. They don't, well, one of them chooses to fail. One of them it becomes very noticeable that they're trying to fail, and this is picked up on by Sol, the Jedi, and so just wants to do it properly, and sort of passes the test and wishes to go with the Jedi, and so this leads to a great deal of conflict between the two children who've got very different views on how they want to go about doing things. Sort of behind the scenes, there's sort of a struggle, there's sort of violence going on. You sort of see the tussle to the point they're sort of crossing a bridge. The Jedi manages to save Osha, who is the child which sort of gets indoctrinated into the Jedi, whereas Mai sort of appears to go missing and appears to be dead sort of from a fall from the fire. So it's clear that obviously she survived. There's obviously history with Osha because she's not currently within the Jedi Order. She's separate from it. So clearly there's sort of issues there dealing with the attachments of what has happened with this event, with this night, to which she can't get through it, can't get past it, is kicked out of the Order as attachment is considered a dangerous path towards the dark side. And so that's sort of the wrapping up that episode, and then obviously there's two more Jedi on the list, sort of responsible for sort of being present within that evening. So you've got Sol, one of the main sort of protagonists, and then you've got the Wookiee Kalnaka, who they will go after on a separate world. So the assassin has a head start with her friend who's been shown in the earlier episodes, who looks to give her advice and guidance. And so they continue on to this jungle world. The assassin appears to have the advantage. She appears conflicted by her actions, whether what she's doing is right, whether it's justified or not. Jedi sort of slog through, very much believing she's going to commit a horrible act. From this, she sort of decides that May decides that she doesn't want to carry out this murder, as it were. And so she traps her friend and goes on to get to said Jedi to warn him, as it were. However, the Jedi themselves has been found murdered, and very much concerned that's going to be her that's going to be seen to have been sort of responsible for said actions. Jedi catch up, obviously not looking too good, and then we get an interaction with sort of a dark force appearing sort of from behind, almost sort of like a Sith, as it were, and this leads into the sort of next episode, sort of episode 5. The previous one being called Day, this one's called Night, where the Jedi engage the Dark Force user very unsuccessfully, as it were. He seems to get the better of most of the Jedi through sort of the different style of lightsaber sort of combat, combination of lightsaber and Force abilities, and sort of struggles against Sol, who's obviously considered a better, sort of more well-trained Jedi. Several of the younger, sort of other previously mentioned Jedi that we've seen in the earlier episodes try to attempt to fight him, to slow him down. Unsuccessfully, having got poked several times through with a lightsaber, having had a broken neck. And then this sort of leads to sort of conflict within the sort of the girls sort of meeting up with each other, not necessarily knowing what to do, sort of one angry with the other for siding with Jedi, one sort of angry for going against the Jedi. This leads to, as I mentioned, sort of conflict. We've managed to find out who the Dark Force user is during the tussle. The character's name is Kuime. I do apologise if I've said that wrong. We sort of recognise him as sort of the friend of Mai previously, to which he's sort of seemingly sort of weak and sort of whimpering is actually sort of strong and confident and sort of a very able user of the Force. Manages obviously to get the better of sort of several Jedi, however sort of gets stopped in the conflict sort of by Sol. There is sort of a tussle between sort of both girls where Mai comes out on top. She cuts her hair in order to look like her sister to then go with Sol. Osha will then go off with Kuime. And then it leads on to the next sort of episode where they sort of get to both understand the other person's sort of point of view, as it were, sort of with the one with the Jedi, sort of one with sort of the dark side of the Force, to which sort of both sort of seem sort of curious and intrigued sort of by this. And it's, you can sort of see Osha sort of the light side, sort of, she's obviously getting tempted by what's being said, that nothing is, that things not necessarily quite as simple. Why is she sort of following a Jedi rule? Why is she not sort of quite questioning things more? It's not that she's been forced to make her mind up on any sort of decisions. She's coming to these conclusions on her own, which is sort of makes the fall sort of a little bit easier to understand, as it were, as it looks like there is a fall sort of coming within these sort of episodes. So from this, we then have a flashback to reveal sort of what happens from the previous flashback from the point of view of the Jedi, what started sort of the explosions, the fires, the battle and sort of and conflict between the Jedi and the dark side sort of Force users, which leads to conflict, which leads to sort of several of the Jedi killing some of those sort of users or sort of Force users. And Mai herself is sort of witness to this, and therefore obviously has issues with the Jedi having but seeing what they do and what they can do to sort of get what they want, as it were. Osha obviously not too understanding of sort of what's happened, what's gone on, and needed this sort of explained to her. And then, so from this, we then have the final episode. Everyone sort of, Sol and Mai sort of go back to where it all started. Kuime and Osha also go back there as well for an effort for them all to sort of, the girls in particular, to remember what's gone on, to sort of explain what's happened, in a desperate need to potentially sort of justify, to understand what's happened, what's gone on from the different sort of sides and views. Excuse me. This obviously leads to a conflict between Sol and Kuime, leads to a conflict between the girls, although not a physical altercation. This is sort of them being able to talk, being able to understand they're sisters after all. There is a strong connection there. So whilst this is going on, Sol, not necessarily being sort of strict to the Jedi code, has sort of gone on a sort of radio silence away from the other Jedi, having been tasked with the idea of finding out sort of who killed sort of the previous Jedi. This sort of spark some of the others within the council to life in order to, so they will end up going to find out what's going on. They'll go to the planet they know where to go to work out what's happening, what's going on. So they are a bit sort of left in the dark by sort of all the actions undertaken. Sort of back to the sort of main sort of conflict. Sol seems to be getting the better in the fight. However, the girls sort of appear within the fight where they sort of begin to question Sol, in particular Osha, who was sort of very much a staunch sort of believer in the Jedi, having partially gone through the Order, having realised the truth, and sort of through sort of the use of sort of pure sort of emotion through the experience, having felt betrayed, conflicted, angry, manages to sort of get hold of Sol's lightsaber, and through the use of sort of the hatred and the emotion, bleeds the lightsaber. So the process of which turning bleeding the crystal of the lightsaber, changing the colour, sort of whether it's blue or green to red, ends up killing Sol. So that leaves sort of the two girls and the Dark Force user to escape, realising with the Jedi are closing in around them, this is not gonna sort of go well. They need to sort of split up, as it were. The Jedi will just keep hunting, keep chasing. Osha decides it's best to go with the sort of Dark Force user under the basis of being able to protect her own sister, although there is obviously an element of curiosity and dark side sort of force being used by her. And Mai, thanks to Kurima's sort of abilities from the dark side, manages to sort of, she has her memories wiped to protect her sort of from this. So she is then captured by the Jedi whilst the other two escape, potentially leading sort of, that's where the end of the story sort of lies, potentially leading to a sort of future sort of seasons where sort of more of the Jedi or several of the other Jedi are sort of aware of what's sort of going on, that the other sister will be found, that this other sort of Force user will be found. I want to go over some of the talking points and then sort of just try and wrap things sort of down. I hope I haven't waffled too much in my explanation. I like to think I've sort of focused on the more key aspects of the story. So there's been sort of several talking points throughout it, and that was sort of the inclusion of several of the other characters within the franchise. Early on, you see a young Ki-Adi-Mundi, who is sort of how best to describe the species without sort of a bit offending anyone. It's a bit of a cone sort of shaped head. I can't remember the exact name of the species, and I'm not necessarily sure how familiar other people watching this might be of that sort of said species. And then there's also the inclusion in the final episode of Yoda, and in the background Darth Plagueis. Now, I'm not overly fond of any of these inclusions. I think they've adjusted Ki-Adi-Mundi's age. Canon sort of says that he wouldn't, original canon sort of timeline, sort of the story written up for said individual character, he shouldn't be alive in that time. He is now, apparently. Don't really know why they needed to include him. Not exactly a main one to get people excited, but just a talking point for people to sort of question what's going on there. Inclusion of Yoda sort of works. He is old enough. Don't really see the need, the point. Darth Plagueis is sort of the main talking point. Now, for those that don't know about him, he is the master of Darth Sidious, the Emperor, sort of the main villain throughout the main Star Wars films. So we already know how he's supposed to die. We already know that he has to live, and he is alive into episode 1. So we know nothing can happen to him even if he becomes a main villain in further series of this down the line. We know the start point, we know the end point, and then it's a case of them sort of filling in the gap between. I'm not a fan of this because we know what's supposed to happen. Obviously, I wasn't necessarily familiar with how old said character was, so it's an effort for it to then link up with other films. I don't like this. I don't think it's needed. You should solely rely on the quality and the writing within one particular series to stand on its own. A good example of where this has worked is Andor. Andor had some very small links to, because of when it was set, to some of the other characters throughout the Star Wars universe, but it relied on the strength of the characters in it and the sort of the story writing for it. This, unfortunately, I think is slightly let down by that, and therefore is almost sort of clutching to the links of other Star Wars characters and properties and events in order to keep people interested and fixated on it, which I'm not overly keen on. I think some of the characters, the story arcs aren't, you could argue they're consistent, but they're not very good. They're not very sort of strong. Sort of seeing several of the Jedi within the storyline being very weak-willed and weak-minded into how they go about doing things, being manipulated so easily. And you could argue that they could. Some of them could get manipulated, but some of them to be driven so heavily by emotion, which is something that they're not supposed to do in the first place, I'm not overly fond of, I'm not overly keen of. I also, when sort of some of the other characters sort of died through their various fights, I felt next to no emotion over this. There was no attachment to them. I like to think that within the story you need to have built them up to be likeable, to be enjoyable, to be sort of characters you really like for and really root for, to then sort of, and then have them sort of just die like that. The emotional sort of gravitas of the situation doesn't hit me, doesn't hit you. You need to be sort of stronger with it all. I'll be perfectly honest. One of the first things to review, I sort of wanted to be a bit more positive and a bit optimistic, it being Star Wars, but this is not. It's not a strong one I'd recommend, and I think this one manages to get the viewers because Star Wars is written in front of it. I think that's sort of selling it. It's not. I think if you took that Star Wars title away from it and it wasn't linked to Star Wars, I think this would bomb, and I think this would bomb hard. Not a fan of it overall. I mean, watch it if you want, but I think there's more to come from the Star Wars universe, and I just don't think following down this path is the right way to go about it. But no, let me know what you think in the comments. Sort of, what your opinions? Did you like it? Did you hate it? What did you like about it? What did you hate about it? Let me know what you'd like me to go over otherwise. But thank you for listening. I'll see you later. Bye for now.